We're back again with another lecture in Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. This lecture is going to be about blood. The blood is kind of the river of life. It's the life-giving connective tissue that connects all of our body. There's things flowing in the blood that allow us to be a multicellular organism. It basically connects all of our cells doesn't matter how far they are apart. Connects our cells with all the functions that they need to do. So it's a very important part of our body. It is a connective tissue. So in our very earlier lecture, when we talked about the different types of tissues, we talked about connective tissue, and blood is connective tissue. One of the components of a connective tissue is that you have cells in the tissue, and blood does have cells. We have red blood cells, we have white blood cells, but then also you have fibers in the extracellular matrix, mainly collagen fiber and elastin fibers. Normally, under normal conditions, blood, you do not see these fibers. They're not floating around in the blood, but there are fibers that are produced when clotting occurs, which we'll talk about later in this lecture. And so blood is a connective tissue. Only fluid tissue and fluid connective tissue in the body. There's a couple components that make up blood. First of all, we have our living cells, our red blood cells, our white blood cells, our platelets. These are called the formed elements. We also have the non-living parts. So we have our formed elements. We have our non-living matrix, which is called the plasma. As far as the blood goes, the formed elements make up less than half of the volume of blood, and the rest of the blood is going to be made up of plasma. About 55% of the blood is plasma. And plasma is basically the fluid part of the blood. Plasma is mainly made out of water. When you give blood, so if you go in and donate your blood, there's a few ways you can do it. But when they take your blood, say you're just going in normally to give blood, they're going to take out your blood and they'll actually separate it into red blood cells and plasma and the other parts of the blood, because they can use these separately as they're giving it to patients that may need transfusions or things like that. Also, you can go in and you can just give plasma. So there are certain places where you can donate plasma. Plasma you can donate a lot more often than you can blood. When you go in to donate blood, you're actually taking out red blood cells, and so your body has to be able to reproduce those red blood cells. So it takes some time. So they won't let you donate blood too much. But plasma you can donate much more often because it is mostly made up of water. So when they take out the plasma, you can just go get a drink of water, and you've already replaced that volume, and then some of the other things that are needed in the plasma can be replaced relatively quickly. I know when I was a college student, they had a plasma donation center there in town, and they targeted a lot of college students. They'd actually pay college students to donate plasma. I never went, but many students did, and for a source of extra income is go donate your body to science, donate some plasma. And what they do is they pull out your blood, they centrifuge it, and then they take out the plasma, and then they'd put the red blood cells and the white blood cells back into your body, so you didn't lose those. All you lose is just that plasma. And so when you take blood, when you centrifuge blood, it'll separate according to what is in that blood, as you see in this picture here. And on top, you're going to have the plasma. So this kind of yellow-looking substance here, this is the plasma. And then you're going to have this very small layer there called the buffy coat. And that is where your white blood cells are going to be sitting. And then finally, here you're going to have the red blood cells, or as we say, erythrocytes. So white blood cells are called leukocytes, red blood cells are erythrocytes. So you can see from this centrifuge here, and a centrifuge, if you're not familiar with a centrifuge, basically what it is, it's a little machine that spins around really fast, and so the parts of the blood separate according to weight as it spins around. So you can see the red blood cells make up a little bit less than half of the total blood volume. Most of it's made up of plasma, and then you have just a little bit of the red blood cells sticking in there as well. This chart here tells what is found in the plasma. So mainly water, so about 90% water. We also have electrolytes, your salts, your sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, etc. All sorts of salts in there. We have proteins, particularly albumin, which is a protein that is always flowing in the blood, and it's going to help maintain the osmotic pressure of blood, osmotic balance. It's also buffering. We have fibrinogen, which we'll see in clotting, and also globulins, or antibodies. Antibodies are flowing around in the blood as well. And then there's also things that are being transported in the plasma, as we'll see in a later lecture. CO2 dissolves into the plasma. Also some oxygen does as well. We have waste, uric acid, urea that are headed out of the body. Also nutrients are glucose, fatty acids, amino acids. All these things that are being transported in the blood are all found inside this plasma of the blood. Then we have the cells here in the blood. Here you can see how erythrocytes is spelled. So red blood cells called erythrocytes. 4 to 6 million per cubic millimeter of blood. That's a lot of red blood cells that are being found here. And their main job, of course, is to transport oxygen around the body. They have the hemoglobin that picks up that oxygen and takes it around the body. Then we have white blood cells, our leukocytes. So leuko means white. And so we call these leukocytes. Cytes means cell. So white cells, basically. A lot less white blood cells in the body. This is part of our immune system. 4,000 to 11,000 per cubic millimeter of blood. And then we have platelets, and there's a lot more platelets than there are white blood cells. Platelets are interesting though because they're not actual cells; they're pieces of a cell. So when platelets are formed, there's a large multinucleated cell that breaks off in these little chunks, and then the platelets flow around in the blood, and they're important in blood clotting. And we'll see that later in this lecture. So those are the main parts of the blood. A few other things to mention about the blood. So the blood has a certain pH that has to be maintained at all times. So blood pH is going to run between 7.35 to 7.45. And so this is slightly over 7, which means that this is basic, slightly basic. And so we have mechanisms in our body to maintain that pH balance in our blood. And if it changes at all, if it becomes too acidic, we call that acidosis. If it becomes too basic, we call that alkalosis. And so our respiratory system, our kidneys are going to be triggered to go through some different mechanisms to maintain this pH balance of our blood. Okay, our blood is also salty, and it tastes like iron. So, you know, when you had a cut and you stuck your finger in your mouth, you taste that saltiness. You also taste the iron, and that iron is found in the hemoglobin of the blood, and it's used to carry around the oxygen, and that's its function there. So that's why you taste that iron. And then also, it's slightly salty. It's about 0.9% salinity, a lot less than seawater, but more than distilled water. And then it has a certain temperature as well. The temperature of blood is going to be about a degree higher than the rest of degrees Celsius higher than the rest of the body. And so your blood is always going to be warmer than the rest of your body. Your blood, if you were to remove all the blood from your body, it makes up about 8% of your body weight. In males, this is about 6 liters, or about 6 quarts of blood. So a liter and a quarter, about the same. So you have about 6 quarts of blood. Think about going and giving blood. You usually give them about a pint of blood. So 6 quarts, you're giving about a half a quart of blood in that. So you still have about 5.5 quarts running around in your body. So anyway, that's about how much. So about 1.5 gallons of blood if you were to fill it up. Fill up a milk jug and a half if you were to take out all the blood in your body. And it'd weigh roughly 12 pounds about. So that's how much your blood weighs. If you look under a slide, and you'll get to see a slide in lab, you can see the different parts of the blood. You're going to be able to see the cells inside the blood. So we have our erythrocytes, and those make up the majority. So all these guys are red blood cells flowing around, lots of erythrocytes. Then we have white blood cells. White blood cells are leukocytes as well. Different types of white blood cells, and we'll look at those different white blood cells here in a minute. But you can tell what type of white blood cell it is depending on how it's stained. So in a blood sample, the white blood cells are always going to be stained purple as you look at them. And then you can also see the little platelets, which would be little purple fragments floating around. Let's talk a little bit about red blood cells. Red blood cells normally look like a little donut. So the donut shape, they've got a little depression in the middle here. And their job, again, is to carry around the oxygen. So they're full of hemoglobin, which is a protein with an iron component in it that picks up that oxygen. It can bind oxygen and release oxygen as it flows through the body, depending on the oxygen needs. So in the lungs, there's lots of oxygen, so the hemoglobin is going to pull that oxygen from the lungs into the blood cells. As it gets to the cells of the body, the cells need that oxygen, so it's going to release that. So it's a reversible binding with oxygen, and it's flexible. So as the red blood cells flowing around the body, it can be compressed just a little bit as it flows through the very smallest blood vessels called capillaries. It can depress just a little bit and move around in there, and so it works well. It's a very functional type of cell. It doesn't have a nucleus anymore, so as red blood cells develop, they lose their nucleus, and so basically all it is a bag of hemoglobin, basically, as it flows through the body. There is a disease called sickle cell anemia that you may be familiar with. This is, in the United States, this is more common in people with African descent. So places where malaria is prevalent, you see a lot of sickle cell anemia. What's happening in sickle cell anemia is the hemoglobin, the protein, the hemoglobin protein, is not being built correctly. And this is due to genetic mutation in the genes, which causes a incorrect sequence of amino acids. So all proteins are built of amino acids. Depending on this sequence of amino acids, that's going to determine the structure of a protein, which determines its function. So here we have a list of amino acids. We have valine, histidine, leucine, threonine, proline, valine, glutamine. These are the amino acids in a sequence of a hemoglobin that causes sickle cell anemia. If you look over here, you see the normal sequence of amino acids. So in sickle cell anemia, there's just one difference, one change in the amino acid sequence. And this is caused by a mutation in the DNA. But just this one change in amino acid, one very small amino acid, that changes the shape of hemoglobin. Now it's no longer going to function as it's supposed to. The hemoglobin starts packing together differently, and so you end up with a sickle-shaped cell for your red blood cells, and that's where it gets the name sickle cell anemia. This shape of red blood cell does not do its job well. It's more brittle. It gets clogged up in the capillaries. So as it's moving through the capillaries, it may get caught, and the blood will start to pack up behind it. It can cause pain, especially in joints and areas in those capillaries. These platelets will break apart, and so the spleen is going to be working overtime to try to remove the blood cells from the broken, destroyed red blood cells from the body. It's not able to carry oxygen as well. Someone that has sickle cell anemia, historically, this would be an infantile disease. This would be something that would kill you before you reach adulthood. Today, with medical technology, people with sickle cell anemia can live much longer, can live a normal life. But this is definitely a problem with the red blood cells. So it leads to anemia. So anemia is a reduction in the number of red blood cells, and it leads to anemia because they're breaking apart and they're not functioning as they should. Another interesting thing about sickle cell anemia, it is a recessive disorder, so that means you have to have 2 copies of the defective gene to actually have sickle cell anemia. If you have just 1 copy, it's called sickle cell trait, and it doesn't cause as many problems as sickle cell anemia. It still can manifest itself in situations when the person is not getting enough oxygen or stressed out or things like that. It can cause the cells to become sickle cell shaped, but in general, it's not going to have the same problems as sickle cell anemia. It's not going to be lethal. There is an interesting connection, as I mentioned, between malaria and sickle cell anemia. Malaria is a parasite, a small organism that infects our blood. It's carried by mosquitoes from one person to another, found in some tropical areas such as Africa, the Middle East. But the parasite attacks the red blood cells. But for some reason, the sickle-shaped cells are immune to the parasite. So someone that has sickle cell anemia actually has an advantage in areas where malaria is prevalent, because malaria can kill someone. And so if they have sickle cell anemia, it gives them an advantage so that they're able to survive. So someone that has sickle cell trait has the best advantage there, because if you have sickle cell anemia, that could kill you. If you have malaria, that could kill you. But if you have sickle cell trait, you kind of have the best of both worlds. You're immune to malaria, and you also don't have full-blown sickle cell anemia. And so the scientists think that's why it's so prevalent in places such as Africa. And so people of African American descent in the United States, that's where you're going to see the sickle cell anemia being more prevalent. There are other things that can cause anemia in the body as well. Any time when you have a decrease in the amount of red blood cells or the amount of hemoglobin in the body, that's going to be termed anemia. It can be caused by cancer, by the lack of certain vitamins that are needed, by hemorrhaging or bacterial infections. Can be caused by a lack of iron in the diet, or bleeding, a lot of bleeding. There could be medications or things like that. Anyway, there's a lot of things that can cause anemia in the body. There's also something called polycythemia, which is when you have too many red blood cells. And there can be some things that cause this as well, such as cancer. Bone cancer can cause polycythemia. Also, if you live at a high altitude, your body is going to naturally produce more red blood cells in order to get more oxygen available. There's less oxygen at high altitudes, so your body produces more red blood cells to pick up that oxygen. Polycythemia is usually not necessarily a problem, except it is going to reduce the circulation, because your blood's going to be what we call more viscous, be less fluid, and so that can be a problem as well. That's it for this section. In the next section, we'll talk about white blood cells, platelets, their formation, and continue from there.